So just to refresh your mind on what we're talking about here, really, when we learned the identity, that's the authentication and authorization system that we used in ASP.NET MVC, also works across all ASP.NET types of projects, whether it's web forms, MVC, web API supports it as well. It's a very important thing for us to get a good handle on. Multiple migrations was one of the topics that we introduced along with this, because there's a lot of choices and decisions we could make here. I should have made that font bigger, sorry. I kind of whipped this together in 2 seconds to focus my thoughts for our discussion, but really there's so many choices, right? We talked last term about, okay, there's situations where you might have separate databases for all the logins and users and all that information from your actual production code, right? You might want them separate. For one thing, you might eventually have multiple projects where you want a common set of security credentials, where if somebody, in a corporation, right, they have their username, their password, all that is all set up with whatever else you've thrown into the identity system to go with it. Why not share that as a common authentication system across multiple different applications, right? So it makes sense to have it in its own database, and that works very, very well. But there are times too where we might say, well, wait a second, something like Azure where you pay a fee to have multiple databases as opposed to one, maybe we'll save some money if we just throw all of it into one database anyway. I mean, it can support multiple tables. We can use schemas to organize tables and so on within the actual database and things like that. So that's a decision that you have to make. Other decisions that come up is, well, do we even really need migrations for the identity system? Are we going to be making further changes, right? It comes packaged using a database initializer, which just creates the database the first time even somebody goes in and registers. You probably remember seeing how that worked. Well, that's okay, and then you don't need to worry about having separate migrations or even multiple migrations. Just do the simple approach that we first learned of enabling migrations. That's all you have to say, add a migration, update database, and so on, away you go for your production code. And you never have to worry about migrations for security because it's never going to change. Well, but then again, sometimes things always do change. So you have to decide, do we want to have migrations enabled for both the security, or the identity system, I should say, and our production code? Well, then we get more decisions, right? Okay. If we're going to have migrations for each, again, have we decided are we going to have separate databases or one database? Well, if you're going to have one database and separate migrations, the technique we focused on last term was we just took our existing DB sets and we just stuck them inside the DbContext that the security system used. So we just had one context object talking to one database, right? We found that was very simple and easy. It didn't really add much in the way of any overhead to the system because even the identity context itself just inherits from DbContext and just has a few DB sets predefined for us for security. So it's really not a major drawback having it together. But remember, one of the things that we ended up doing quite often last year was manually going in. When we would create our different migrations, we would often manually go in and make little wee tweaks here and there. Maybe we'd add that secondary index, right, for a unique constraint somewhere. It could even be across a combination of fields possibly. Well, wait a second, we just learned earlier this term that now ND Framework 6.2 supports a new index attribute, right, where you can basically create secondary indexes, unique or not, across one or combinations of properties in a class, and it automatically will scaffold the correct secondary indexes in the database. So that's one less reason to go in and tweak the actual migrations. The problem with tweaking migrations is it's code that gets generated for us automatically, right? The system, we just tell it to add a migration and it looks for differences and changes and generates the migration. So the ideal thing is for us not to go in and manually change it. And that way we don't have to go in and manually be deciding, oh, well, I want a cascade delete on this relationship and not in this one, and so on. So we remember that, I don't know about you, but my personal preference always was to have the default not to cascade delete, for example, even though the identity system requires that that be the default. So it's just one example of where there are differences in the approach that we might likely use in our production code from our actual security code, the identity system. So the first thing that might occur to you next is, well, why not have, because remember we set those various conventions as we defined the actual context object we would use to talk to the database. Why can't we have two separate DbContexts looking at the same database? That would allow us to have different sets of conventions and so on for each context, even though we're still storing all the data in a single database. My first thought was, that is the stupidest idea I've ever heard of. The reason that was my initial reaction goes back to the early days of working with ODBC, Open Database Connectivity, and different standards for connecting to database systems of all different sorts. And usually one of the biggest concerns developers had back then was maintaining connections. There's a finite number of connections any database will support. And as you get too many connections, performance goes down and down dramatically, right? So you'd get into things like connection pooling, where multiple client applications or clients could be running at the same time and pool connections so that you weren't creating a separate connection for each user, for each application, whatever the case may be. So my first thought was, well, having two separate DbContexts, okay, each with its own connection into the database, was a very bad idea. I'm wrong. Okay? I've since found out that, no, you're not giving Entity Framework enough credit, Dave, right? Entity Framework actually does already an excellent job of managing, pooling, etc., all of the connections to the database itself. So, really it is not considered bad practice, and in some cases, if you do some reading in the various blogs, they talk about numerous advantages to having separate DbContexts talking to the same database at the same time. So that's something we've never looked at, how to actually set that up and do that last term. So I thought, you know, here's a case where we're building a web API. Even if I just use the example of the tutorial that we've been looking at, if we use that as an example and say, okay, he didn't include identity, but you know, we might want to use that. We might want to, even just in our SPA scenario using Knockout or Angular, we might want to have people register and so on and authenticate whether or not they're allowed to call certain API REST calls, right? And that's easily done using the identity system. So it gives us a chance to review that point kind of left dangling from last year and my misconception about having multiple DbContexts. We can see how that can be done quite easily at the same time that we refresh our minds on working with multiple migrations, and looking forward, we'll possibly be able to utilize the security in our web API eventually as well. So if you're game, we'll just quickly go through a little demo based on those concepts. Yes, okay, good, all right. And hopefully my mic caught all that. Huge PowerPoint slide, slide 2 of 2. Okay, so that's our little scenario here, but I'm going to go right into Visual Studio. Okay, so basically following the tutorial example then, right, he had us create a new project. It's a web application, and I should call it, maybe I should call it book service like he did. I've been burned too many times by having too many things named the same. So even solutions I like to name differently from projects, which of course should be named different from the classes you're planning to put in the projects and so on. Okay. Actually, does he make a book service anything? I think we'll always qualify it, so we're okay there. All right. So I think I should check again, but I think he just tells us to go ahead and make a web API. By the way, if we get time later on to talk about the ASP.5, this is the new v.next, they call it, of ASP. I don't want to get too off topic here, but Has anybody been looking into it to realize what the changes are in the next generation? It's not only totally open source, it's totally cross-platform. So OS X, Linux, no longer requires a Microsoft web server anymore.
Is that with the PROG1698 now?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's exactly it.
Wait, how does that work then?
It doesn't use the system.web anymore, so it's not required, doesn't require IIS. It uses, well, it can use multiple different web servers, web services, and so on, and it's all based on open standards. It's all, it uses .NET Core.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I got it running with DNX and ENVM, the runtime environments for OS X.
Okay.
So it's nice to see it run there.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, it introduces all kinds of new stuff. It's a totally new learning curve. I'm sorry to say. It's very different. Although, you know, you can use Visual Studio or you can use the new Visual Studio Code.
So is NuGet being like removed?
Nope, NuGet's still there.
Still there?
Yeah, NuGet is still very much a part of it.
Because you know a lot of things are moving towards like Bower and like.
Well, yeah, it supports Bower and Grunt and so on. So for your bundling and minimization and all that kind of stuff. Oh yeah, all kinds of new catchy phrases to learn. And when the first time I saw Grunt, I mean, oh, that sounds like me at 4 in the morning when I just can't get that code to work. Grunt, Grunt. I'm not sure what Bower. I mean, I think of Jack Bauer. Tell me where the device is. Tell me. Oh, sorry. I'm getting off topic. All right. Well, if we get time, we'll have more of a look at that. But for now, we'll just do a web API. And I'm going to leave it on the individual user accounts. I'm not going to worry about hosting in the cloud at this point in time. Okay, we're ready to start now in the project. So usually the first things that the tutorial does, this isn't any different, is we got to have some models in place, right? So I'll just add a class here. I think the first one is our author. I've got so little light in this corner of the room, it's hard to see the keyboard when I'm looking at the screen and I look down. Okay, so I'm just going to take it exactly as he gave it. One little thing I should maybe talk about, he explains it in the tutorial, but you're probably used to, of course I'm going to use my good friend control period a lot here for adding usings. So there's our data annotations. We're used to having navigation properties in both the parent and the child. Right? That's how we would always set up our entities last term with using Entity Framework. So in a child, you would actually have a foreign key, a virtual object of the type of the parent, as well as we would usually, for our convenience as programmers, include an actual foreign key, like if it was a integer identity primary key on the parent side, we have integer, right, for the foreign key on the child. And we're going to do that again here, but we usually, in the parent, would add a collection, right, to hold all the child objects. That was a navigation property we used, so we could go .include and eagerly load all of the children into the parent object when we retrieved it from the database, right? It was much more efficient than going back lazy loading and going and asking for it afterwards. There's a good reason why these classes we're missing out of the parent here. We don't have any collection of books inside the parent. That's because of how JSON serializes things, because we're going to use JSON, JavaScript Object Model Notation. By default, you'll end up in a circular reference with both navigation properties, and so it'll just crap out. And there's several ways to get around it, but the simplest thing is we're not even going to focus on the books other than getting books for a drop-down list. So we'll just leave out that one navigation property. The foreign key will work without it. We just lose a bit of convenience we used to have with the other approach. Okay, sorry, a bit of a digression there, but it doesn't hurt to explain things a little. And another class for book or books, book. Right. Bite my tongue talking in plurals for objects. Okay, so we'll have a public class book here. with a few different things. Of course, I got to add my little bit of data annotation using. And there's our foreign key, the author ID I was just talking about, and then we actually have a author object that we can store in the child as well. That gives us access to all the properties of the author, and that's good. And we don't create a circular reference with those two. Okay. Just because I may use it, it'll refresh our memory as well. Let's add another class here. I'm not actually going to use this in my demo today, but remember this guy? Auditable, right? Just because if I'm going to do this, I might as well set it up as sort of a generic project I might reuse, right? So include everything but the kitchen sink here that I might want to access. So suppose I want to use some timestamp concurrency and maybe audit fields for updated on and so on. Then later on I can use this. I'm just adding it so I can add the code in my one DbContext to automatically update these fields for me if the class implements this interface, right? Just a quick refresher for it. Okay, so there's my basic model classes that I need for now. Just save all those, close them up. Okay, so just getting some things in place. Now, when it comes to our migrations, what we did last term is we would just say, enable migrations in our package manager console, which works fine, and it creates a migrations folder in the root of the project structure. If we're going to have multiple migrations, it kind of makes sense, you know, for those of us that are, because I'm being a hypocrite here, because I'm not one of the most organized people in the world, but if I was trying to be one of the organized people in the world, I would like to put all the migrations in one spot rather than having them spread out throughout the project. So we did often use a sort of a root folder to handle all the data access layer kind of information. So I'm going to follow that approach again and throw all the migrations under it, right? So if I come up here to the top and add just the folder, the naming convention we used last year was DAL for data access layer. It's a throwback to the old days of planning end-tier development, but that's okay, it kind of works. So inside my DAL, I'm going to put things like add a class here for my context, right? I created my book and my author, but I'm going to need DB sets there and so on, okay? So if I create I'll call it a book service context. Why? Because I thought about it and that name kind of made sense to me, right? So it'll be a public class. And this is the one that we're going to inherit from DbContext. And it says what the heck is that, but of course we know control period. I can add the using for system data entity, and now it knows what that is, right? So there's our context object. Now we sometimes did and sometimes usually didn't bother with an actual constructor for our context. We noticed that there was one for the built-in application DbContext that's there for security. But you know, one of the things that's nice about doing the constructor, it gives you the chance to override the actual name of the connection string quite easily, right? So I'm just going to grab a bit of code here to throw in, and I'll talk about the code after I get it in place. Okay, so first of all, this constructor isn't needed, but it gives me a chance to specify the name that I'm going to use in the connection, the name of the connection string, right? Remember, this is all going to be in the same database. In fact, I can take that right now, copy that, because that's my plan, is to use that as the name of the connection string, come down to web config where the connection string lives, right? Right now it's called default connection. Well, I'm going to change that to this name. And I can leave the rest the same. It'll work just fine the way it is. It's set up to use SQL Server 2014 local DB at the moment, right? Which is fine. I could leave this big, long, ugly name that it created for the database, or I could change it. It really doesn't matter much because when I publish this to Azure, it'll be a different database anyway, right? So I can change it if I want. I guess I usually did last term, so let me just call it book service, I guess. Because having the date time component there kind of helped it be unique, right? Anyway. All right, so there's my connection string for the actual one and only database that I'm going to use. Okay, so what else do I have in here? Well, of course, I have to add a using just because this is in a separate subdirectory, so I have to add a using for the models folder, basically, from my book service. And these two conventions, they're in a different namespace, so I'll just add yet another namespace up here, model configuration conventions. Okay. Well, remember this? This was to do with that in case at some point in the future I decide to automatically add auditing, right, to a given class or entity, then this is all set up so that I can override save changes and provide, if it's available, the actual username and when the person has updated information, whether they're creating or updating. So may or may not get time to use this code, but we might as well have it in place because I think I hopefully will. And I think that this is okay. So that's all my red squiggles are gone. So again, to review, this is really just about these two guys, right? That's the main reason we have the context. So we have our DB sets, so I can work with this collection of book objects and author objects, just like we did last term. All this other code was really just some gravy on the top and some vegetables on the side, right? Setting some conventions on how I like cascade delete set up or not set up and so on, and overriding save changes just for this, right? So those are very much suitable settings that I want to put in place only for my actual books and authors, my production code, right? I wouldn't want to try and do this in my context for the security system because I'd mess things up, right? Security system has to have certain conventions a certain way and so on and so forth. That's okay. I will get to that in a moment then. All right, so now I'm going to make in my DAL folder yet another class. This one is going to be for the security system, right? So I'm going to call it IdentityContext. So I'm organizing it under my DAL folder, so I've got my book service context and my identity context for security. And the same thing, I'm going to, inherit from DbContext and so on and so forth. So let me just actually do a bit of copy-paste magic to save some time. Now again, I need to add some usings. And the application user, well, that lives over in the models folder as well. Okay. So we see here in the constructor, right, I've already put in place in my code the same name. That's why both of these contexts are going to again end up working with the exact same database. The database will hold all the tables for both contexts. But having two separate contexts allows us to have separate conventions, overriding the save changes in one but not in the other, and so on. So there's definite differences in how the communication goes with the database through these two different connections, the two different DbContext objects themselves. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to have not exactly the same. They each need their own unique aspects, and now we're supporting that even using the same database. Okay. Now, right now, though, at this point, I'd have to do a bit of cleanup because way down here in models, right, I do have in the identity models, right, so here is my application DbContext, right. That's the one I've just created. I gave it a slightly different name because I find it clearer, you know, if I just call it application, well, is that the one for security, the identity system, or not, right? So I changed the name, and I'm just going to basically take this and delete it, because I already have that in my DAL folder. I might as well leave the model here for the application user. Makes sense, that is an actual entity model. It was kind of a lazy thing, in my opinion, that they put a DbContext in the middle of a model class anyway. What were they thinking, those guys at Microsoft? I don't know what they're, oh well. Now, of course, I'm going to have a problem because application DbContext is referenced in a few places in the overall project. But, you know, I can quickly find out where. In fact, if I'd left the code there, would have made it easier. But, you know, there's multiple ways. I can do just a control find replace application DbContext. Right? And I'm going to replace it with IdentityContext. In current project. Right, so we see it here in identity config, right? It's also here in startup auth. So there's a couple places, okay, that I needed to update references to application DbContext. I could also just right-clicked on it and said find all references, gone to each one that way, or use refactoring. There's multiple ways to rename things, but I think I should be good. I can do a build now just to check. And if there's some reference to application DbContext that I haven't fixed yet, then it won't build properly and I'll get a build error. Okay, so that's okay. I fixed that here, but I need to add the using, right? Because it's now in a DAL folder, right? So it's in a different spot. Using bookservice.dal. And again here. Okay, Microsoft does do some things right. Microsoft caught me from being a silly idiot and not adding those usings. So there we go. I probably could clean up all the old usings, but we'll leave that for another time. Okay, so we're almost ready. Let me just stop and think for a second. I have my two contexts under my DAL. So now I really want to enable migrations on each one. So we have to go to the Package Manager console for that. Quick and easy way to get there. Pack. Okay, so I'm ready to start. And as I said, in the old days, I could just go enable migrations and press enter. And it would come up and say, wait a second, I see more than one DbContext, and would offer, right, to run one or the other of the two commands, one for each DbContext. Well, actually, let me do it, because it won't work. It will actually come up and say multiple contexts. Which one do you want to enable migrations on? And it gives you the actual command to use. Remember, that's what we did. So which one do I want to start with? Well, it doesn't really matter. So I'll grab this one here, and we'll just have a look at what the command actually is doing for us, right? What we see, let me just make some more. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, enable migration. So this context type name allows us to specify which of the two contexts I'm after. Now notice it's fully qualifying it. Actually, I could just say IdentityContext because there's no confusion about that, but it doesn't hurt to have it fully qualified. By the way, you might think that there's no IntelliSense in here, but there is what they call tab completion. So if I wanted to write this myself, right? If I didn't want help, I can go just the dash and then press the tab key, and then I get, you know, kind of looks like IntelliSense, but it's really just tab completion is what they call it, because that's a PowerShell thing. We aren't working in C# here. We're not actually in Visual Studio, right? We're in PowerShell. So it's good to know, though, that there is some support for us in PowerShell as well. It's funny because I remember seeing a few videos where they demonstrated this, but he never said how he did it. And it took me, I was scratching my head, and I finally did some Googling and, well, actually Binging, of course, Mr. Microsoft. and found out, oh, okay, it's tab completion. So that's how you do it. So context type name, that's good. I'll just put the context back. But right now, it will create a migrations folder in the root of the project. I don't want that. I want it onto that DAL folder. Fortunately, how did I do that again? Dash tab. Look at this, migrations directory. Woo! Okay, migrations directory. So the directory I want to create all the migrations for this context. Well, I can even use a hierarchy here. I can put it under DAL, and maybe I'll call it identity migrations. Okay. So we've specified which of the two contexts, but not only that, we've said what, where, and what to name the actual migrations folder. So this is very important, because otherwise, if you just do it all in one migrations folder, then files will overwrite each other all the time, and you can do a dash force to make that happen, but you're just shooting yourself in the foot if you do, right? So this allows me to get it really organized. So I can see under DAL now, not only do I have my two contexts, but I have my identity migrations. There's a configuration class here, right? And I can basically do the same thing for the other, okay? So just to save a bit of time, it's exactly the same process, but I will enable migrations. In this case, for context type name, book service context, migration directory, DAL / book service migrations. And that should make my other migrations directory as a subdirectory under DAL and its own configuration file, right? So I can appropriately add seed data into each one. He gave us in his tutorial some seed data for the actual books, which I will just grab. You could grab it out of the tutorial, but I have it in my text file here. So, so for the book service, right? I'll just get rid of these comments. And so we're just populating a few books. Now, of course, again, because I'm not following having everything in the root of everywhere, I need to just add my namespaces here and there. So book service models to find the author in the book. And then that should be good. So I'll just populate a few authors and books. Now, for security, I can do the same thing down here. Now, what do I want to seed in security? Remember, we talked about this. This is a quick review. You can actually populate the tables, but remember, a lot of the values are hashes and things generated, GUIDs and so on by the system. So it's actually far better to use the built-in methods that are there as part of the DLLs that support the identity system. And so code, this will look familiar once I grab it here. Using our user manager and role manager, right? Oop. Keeps doing that on me in my text file here. Let me just grab some of my text. I might be missing a curly brace. I'll find out in a second. Okay. So just some usings to add. ASP.NET identity. Identity role is in a slightly different namespace. ASP.NET identity entity framework. Okay. Application user, well, that's our guy. He lives in the models folder. A lot of using there. And that seems to be all the squigglies. Okay. Just a quick review then. What's going on here? Well, we create a role manager, right? And we use that to create an admin role. So we have an administrator. We'll just loop through and make 4 generic users, just so that we don't have to register and go through that process. And just call them user 1, user 2, user 3 at outlook.com. I'm setting password to password, which it will let me do it this way. It bypasses the restrictions that you actually have entering the data on the web form. right? Where remember, right now by default it said you have to have capitals and small letters and numbers and weird digits and characters and happy faces that have frowny smiles and all kinds of weird restrictions like that, right? But I think this will let me do it anyway. If I want to, just as a refresher, where is that setting where I can set the password restrictions? Anyone remember?
Yeah.
Ah, good. App
Start.
start.
Identity thing.
You got it. So I could come in here. There we are, password validator. Set all these to false. And that lets me just put in the password, which is what I prefer to do. Oop. Okay. That's neither here nor there. All right, so we're almost ready, right? We're actually ready now to go back to our package manager console. And I think that we can actually generate the database. And it doesn't matter in this case which one I complete the steps on, right? But because we have multiple migrations, we have to be qualifying every time now to say which migration folder to go and look in, right? So it doesn't matter. I'll add a migration to our book service. Right? So configuration type name is required from now on whenever I do an add migration or update database. And this time we actually do have to fully qualify the namespace path, so to speak, to the actual configuration file. Okay? So this should generate the up and the down of the migration, right? So creating our author, our book, okay? Notice that our foreign key does not enable cascade delete, right? So I can't delete an author that has books, which is how I prefer most production data to work, and so on and so forth. So we're good there, right? So I could just actually update the database now, which is almost the same command. It's just update database, same configuration type name. Of course, I don't have to pass a name for anything. And if all goes well, there we go. Now we have it created, right? And the database is there. Now I can do the same type of code, though, for the identity system. I'll add a migration there for my security. Again, configuration type name for the identity migrations configuration. And we'll update the database. And that's it. Now, what have we got? Well, if I come up here to the app data folder, click the Don't Lie to Me button. Then I see here is my MDF file, so I'm using the one MDF file. Has all the tables here for my users and roles, the whole security system. I should even find that there is a role defined at our administrator role. So if I show table data here, right, there's my admin role. If I have a look at users, I should have a 4 or 5 users, I think. Yeah. The first one is our admin user, of course. Then I have my user 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Of course, the passwords and everything, this is all encrypted, right? So that's one reason why it's better to use the built-in managers for the identity system than try and insert this data directly ourselves. And that's good. So, of course, we also have our books and authors, right? They've been populated with our sample data here as well. So basically, that takes us up to the point where in the tutorial now you go on, you create your controllers and start building the rest of the application. That's straightforward from here on in. And, you know, in this tutorial, there's no need actually to use the authentication. Although you could start decorating the web API controllers with the same authorize and roles and so on, the way we did restrictions using the MVC framework as well last term. So we could incorporate that into our application since we're doing a SPA anyway. But for now, I just wanted to cover those basics because it's kind of new, kind of the same, and it's a different take on things. The main point of this whole exercise, again, was to, well, not only have nicely organized, but basically here we have two separate contexts, two separate sets of migrations. So now if I decide to modify what an application user looks like, store address information and other contact information for each user, I can just go in, add a migration, update the database, and it will just affect those tables, right? And anything I do for the actual production, books, authors, and so on, add new entities there and things like that. I can do separate migrations there to modify those tables. So I have kind of the best of all worlds with this arrangement, right? So I just thought I'd share that with you. You know, you could even do up a generic project like this and use as a starting point for future development, right? Where you already have your code in place. In fact, I'll post this as it is now as a starting point if you want to use this and go on in the tutorial. Any questions about that demo? Okay.
Can we get a knockout stuff?
What's that?